Iran protests are spreading again, and the what next is now the story. As of January 2nd, 2026, anti-government protests in Iran are widening and turning more volatile, with reports of deaths, arrests, and intensifying crackdowns. Economic factors such as currency collapse, inflation, and pressure on livelihoods serve as the immediate trigger. But the growing political rhetoric on the streets heightens the risks for both protesters and the state. A new, fast-moving twist is sharpening the risk. Washington has issued threats tied to how Iran handles the unrest, and senior Iranian officials have fired back. This external pressure could either restrain violence or harden the state's stance, particularly if leaders portray the protests as foreign-instigated. This piece lays out what is solid, what is contested, and the signals that would indicate escalation. It also maps the likely scenarios from here without pretending that the endgame is already written. The story turns on whether the protests stay a bargainable economic revolt or become a political rupture the state decides it must crush. Key points. Protests triggered by a sharp currency slide and cost of living pressure have spread beyond Tehran's commercial districts into universities and multiple cities. Reported fatalities and injuries mark a clear escalation from the early days of shop closures and street marches. Exact death totals remain contested. Western provinces appear to be a focal point for the most intense confrontations, while arrests are being reported across several areas. Authorities are mixing signals, public talk of dialogue and reforms alongside sharp warnings, arrests, and forceful dispersal. A new geopolitical overhang, US threats tied to the crackdown and Iran's retaliatory warnings, adds a volatile miscalculation risk. The next phase depends less on slogans and more on whether strikes expand, whether security forces fracture or unify, and whether communication channels are restricted. Background. This protest wave began with shopkeepers and bazaar merchants closing stores in Tehran as the rial hit record lows and prices surged. Students then joined in at multiple universities, widening the movement's social base and increasing its visibility. The government responded with a promise of dialogue and a mechanism for talks, while also reshuffling economic leadership, including at the central bank. The economic stress is not new, but the spark is sharper. The currency's rapid drop compresses daily life. Quickly, imports get pricier overnight, savings erode, and merchants cannot price goods with confidence. In Iran's recent history, that kind of shock can turn localized protests into nationwide contagion. Iran's leadership is also operating in a tense regional context. Sanctions pressure, recent regional conflict, and heightened security paranoia change the state's tolerance for unrest and its appetite for risk. That matters because these protests are not only about prices, they are increasingly about legitimacy, analysis, what's confirmed versus what's disputed. There is broad confirmation of protests linked to economic grievances, including store closures and demonstrations in Tehran and other cities, and credible reporting of multiple deaths since midweek. There is also strong evidence of arrests and a more forceful security posture, including allegations of live fire in some locations. What remains disputed is the full scope, precise death totals, the number of cities with sustained large crowds, and the details around specific incidents, especially where the government and rights monitors offer conflicting accounts. Some claims circulating online about deaths and security force behavior in particular towns cannot be verified in real time. Political and geopolitical dimensions. The biggest new development is the overlay of external threats. The US president has publicly warned of intervention tied to how Iran treats protesters, while senior Iranian officials have replied that interference crosses a national security red line and would trigger consequences. That exchange increases the chance that Iran's leadership attempts to reframe the unrest as a sovereignty crisis rather than an economic one. The issue matters because foreign interference narratives can unify hardliners, justify harsher measures, and pressure moderates to fall in line. At the same time, overt foreign threats can also make the state more cautious. about overt mass violence if leaders fear a wider confrontation. Either path can intensify instability, just in different ways. Scenario-wise, there are three plausible tracks: an internal security crackdown, with limited external fallout, a mixed approach where concessions are offered to merchants, while political protests are suppressed, or a broader regional escalation if rhetoric turns into action and proxies or military forces are pulled into the spiral. Economic and market impact. The protests are rooted in the mechanics of currency panic. When the rial drops rapidly, merchants shut because they cannot restock or price inventory. The result is a self-reinforcing cycle. Closures signal panic. Panic drives more currency demand, and the cost of living rises further. The government's room to maneuver is limited. Tightening controls may stabilize official markets, but fuels black market pressure and public anger. Liberalizing exchange can relieve bottlenecks, but risks further depreciation and inflation. If strikes persist in commercial hubs, the state faces not only street protests, but an economic slowdown that hits tax revenues and supply chains. For global markets, the immediate watchpoints are not daily street scenes but the risk premium on regional security, shipping, energy infrastructure, and sanctions enforcement dynamics. Even without direct disruption, perceived instability can move expectations. Social and cultural fallout. Merchant-led protests are socially significant because they cut across class lines. A shopkeeper who cannot restock, a student facing future joblessness, and a household seeing food prices spike can align quickly around shared frustration. That alignment is more durable when it is experienced daily. Reports from various locations indicate that the movement extends beyond reformist demands. When calls shift from fix the economy to change the system, the state's incentives change too. Leaders may conclude that any concession signals weakness and invites further escalation. At the same time, fear is a real constraint. Iran's recent history of arrests and harsh sentencing shapes participation decisions. If the public perceives that the crackdown is targeted and effective, turnout can drop. If the public sees violence as indiscriminate, anger can grow and funerals can become rally points. Technological and security implications. Information control will likely decide the protest tempo. Even without a nationwide shutdown, localized disruptions, throttling, and surveillance can slow coordination and reduce the visibility that fuels momentum. Arrests linked to alleged weapon-making and public disorder charges also indicate an emphasis on disrupting networks, not just dispersing crowds. Security posture is the other hinge. If regular police, bussage units, and other forces appear unified and willing to escalate, protests face a steep uphill fight. If there are signs of hesitation, fragmentation, or quiet sympathy, especially in cities with deep economic pain, the state's deterrence weakens. What most coverage misses. The overlooked factor is the identity of the early movers. Merchant and bazaar action is not just another street protest, it is pressure applied to the system's circulatory system. Closing the shops is a signal that the economic engine is refusing to run under current rules. That is harder to dismiss than a single rally, and it is harder to solve with arrests alone if the underlying currency panic continues. The second-order effect is that external threats can backfire. Public U.S. warnings may feel supportive from afar, but inside Iran they can help officials argue that unrest is being weaponized by rivals. That narrative does not have to be true to be effective. It can compress political space, reduce the chance of meaningful concessions, and raise the odds of force. Finally, the key metric is not crowd size on a single night. It is persistence, plus spread into sectors that the state cannot easily police. Sustained strikes, university stoppages, and professional class participation. That combination turns episodic unrest into a national governance problem. Why this matters? Inside Iran, the most immediate impacts are on households already stretched by inflation, and on small businesses trapped between collapsing purchasing power and unstable supply. Regions with concentrated confrontations face greater risk of casualties, arrests, and disruptions to daily life. In the short term, the world should watch for concrete signals, confirmed death toll jumps, large-scale arrests, sustained strikes in multiple major cities, or sweeping communication restrictions. In the medium term, the question is whether the government can stabilize the currency without igniting more anger, and whether dialogue efforts are real or performative. Outside Iran, the situation matters because internal instability can reshape regional risk calculations. It can also affect nuclear diplomacy dynamics and sanctions posture, especially if leaders believe they must project strength at home and abroad simultaneously. Real-world impact. A shop owner in central Tehran closes for a third straight day because replacement inventory cannot be priced reliably. He continues to pay his staff, depletes his savings, and overhears customers discussing the urgency of purchasing essentials. A university student in Isfahan attends daytime campus protests, then avoids main roads at night after hearing reports of arrests. She deletes messages, limits contacts, and weighs whether the next gathering is worth the risk. A family in Zahedan watches prices rise and transport become less predictable as tension grows. One relative avoids clinics and government offices, fearing heightened checks and questioning. A small importer in a Gulf business hub pauses shipments to Iran because the exchange rate swings too quickly to quote customers. That deepens shortages and pushes more transactions into informal channels. What's next? A clash of incentives will shape the next phase. Protesters want momentum, visibility, and broad participation. The state wants to prevent coordination, isolate flashpoints, and stop economic strikes from becoming a political movement. There are three near-term paths. One is suppression, arrests rise, force becomes more routine, and protests fragment into smaller, riskier pockets. Another is containment through selective concessions, economic steps aimed at merchants, paired with harsher action against political slogans and campus organizing. The third is escalation through miscalculation, a sharp spike in deaths, a major communications clampdown, or a geopolitical incident that pulls external actors into the narrative. The clearest indicators will be practical, not rhetorical, whether bazaars and universities continue to close, whether security forces shift from dispersal to sustained occupation, whether communications are significantly restricted, and whether reported fatalities rise day over day. Those signals will show whether Iran is entering a short, brutal crackdown or a longer rolling challenge to the state's control. More insight, less noise. Explore the full range at taylortaylor.co.uk.